Okay, so, we're diving into Anne Rice's interview with the vampire today. And you shared those excerpts with me.
Yeah,
And right off the bat, that opening reflection from the narrator, looking back on their human life, it,
right.
it really stood out to me, especially the focus on that one person near the oratory. It's like there's this huge irony
Mm,
when the vampire is thinking back on a time when they felt completely ordinary, compared to this person who seemed so regular, so normal at the time.
mm,
But now, of course, the tables have totally turned.
right. I mean, it really hits you with that dramatic irony from the start, right? It
Exactly.
makes it clear this isn't just going to be a story about fangs and supernatural powers.
Right.
It's about how completely someone's view of themselves and the world can shift when they go through such a drastic transformation.
Absolutely. And that really sets the stage for our deep dive today, doesn't it? We're going to follow the narrator's journey through those early years as a vampire,
Yeah, we'll see how their perspective changes with each experience.
right? And grapple with those big questions that come up about identity, morality, and how they fit into this whole new existence.
Exactly, and how even the simple things like relationships become so much more complicated.
Right. So, we should start with that initial encounter, the one in the garden by the oratory.
Okay, yeah.
The narrator describes these conversations they had with the person who would eventually turn them into a vampire. And it's interesting how mundane those conversations seem.
Right. It's all very everyday stuff, isn't it? Troubles with the slaves, the overseer, the weather brokers.
Yeah, just the ordinary worries of the time.
Yeah, but that contrast actually makes the transformation even more impactful.
I see what you mean. It's like you're lulled into this sense of normalcy right before everything changes.
Exactly. And the narrator talks about feeling so understood by this person, like their troubles were actually eased just by talking to them.
And that vow they make about this person entering the priesthood even after heartbreak, that really shows how deeply they connected.
It really does. I mean, looking back from their vampire perspective, the narrator must see how ironic that vow was.
Hmm,
Right, because they place so much trust in someone who had completely different intentions. It makes you think about how easily our perception can be manipulated by our own needs and desires.
definitely. Then we get to the actual transformation itself. And it's interesting how the narrator describes it.
Hmm.
They don't really say they decided to become a vampire, but it wasn't exactly forced on them either.
It's like reaching a point of no return after that encounter.
Exactly.
And there's that one detail that just stays with you, that last sunrise.
Oof, yeah. That image is so powerful.
To look back at the rising sun and know it's the last time you'll experience it with human eyes.
It represents such a huge loss.
It really does. It's a farewell to the beauty and warmth of the mortal world.
Definitely. And then we see the immediate aftermath of that transformation and the narrator's struggles to come to terms with their new reality.
Right. I mean, Babette's reaction is pretty intense.
She's terrified. She thinks the narrator's a demon.
Yeah, from the devil, she says.
It's a brutal reality check for the narrator.
It is. They probably still cling to some part of their human self, and then they're suddenly confronted with being seen as a monster.
Hmm.
This is where the psychological impact of becoming a vampire really hits home. It's not just the physical change.
Right. It's that feeling of alienation, that breakdown in communication with Babette.
That sense of weariness.
Yeah, and those endless nights stretching ahead with no real connection.
Right, because how do you connect with anyone when you have to hide your true nature?
Exactly. And then Lestat enters the picture. And he's such a contrast to the person who made the narrator a vampire.
Oh, yeah, totally different.
And one of the first things he does is stage those killings for the narrator to witness.
Hmm.
It's brutal and almost feels like a lesson in what being a vampire really means.
I think it's more than a lesson. It's Lestat forcing the narrator to face the reality of what they are.
You're right. It's like he's trying to strip away any lingering illusions.
Exactly. And it definitely triggers a lot of inner turmoil for the narrator.
There's anger at Lestat's cruelty, but also all these questions about their own nature.
And that's where the moral struggle really kicks in.
Right, because the narrator is clearly repulsed by what they see.
Yeah, they're not ready to just accept this predatory role without a fight.
Exactly. And that struggle becomes even more intense when the narrator questions Lestat about killing humans.
They even suggest drinking animal blood instead.
Right, like trying to hold on to some kind of ethical boundary.
And Lestat's response is so cynical, isn't it?
Hmm.
He mocks the idea of finding fulfillment without killing humans and dismisses the narrator's morals as just remnants of their human life.
But he also presents this twisted view of death as something beautiful that only vampires can truly understand.
It's disturbing, but also kind of persuasive in a way.
Yeah, he's essentially redefining morality from a vampire's perspective.
Right, trying to break down the narrator's resistance.
And then Claudia comes into the picture.
Yeah, she adds a whole new level of complexity.
transforming her into a child vampire is just so disturbing.
It really makes you question the whole idea of innocence and morality in this context.
Especially because even as a child, she has this capacity for killing.
Right, and it's interesting how the narrator describes becoming more detached from the act of killing themselves.
Like it's becoming a necessity. But Claudia, she develops these very specific patterns in choosing her victims.
Yeah, it's usually the poor, immigrants, people in the cemetery.
Almost like she's targeting those who are already vulnerable.
Right, and Lestat's reactions are so chilling, he just dismisses it all with those nicknames like infant death.
Ugh, it's awful. But Claudia, she starts to understand her vampire nature more deeply.
Remember when she talks about eyes?
Yeah, and she has that line about how they taught her to drink the world, but she's still hungry for more than.
It's like she's grasping the power of her existence, but also sensing a huge emptiness.
Right, and that sense of emptiness seems to fuel the growing tension between them and Lestat.
Definitely, Claudia starts to recognize her own difference from humans.
And she connects with the narrator's desire for something more.
More than just Lestat's cynical worldview.
Yeah, and that leads to the decision to leave him.
Claudia's the one who voices it first.
Right, she realizes that she was made to be the narrator's companion.
Mm.
And even though the narrator's hesitant at first, they eventually agree to go with her.
It's a big turning point. They're finally taking control of their own destiny.
But Claudia wants to kill Lestat.
And the narrator is understandably terrified of what he might do.
Right. He's so powerful.
Then we have that scene where Lestat returns totally oblivious to their plans.
Oh, the irony is just so thick.
He's boasting about his latest man's making music.
Completely unaware of the danger he's in.
And then they put their plan into action.
That description of disposing of Lestat's body in the bayou is so vivid.
The chrysanthemums, the smell.
The way they talk about his body being almost weightless.
And the narrator being drawn to the dark water. It's like they're almost pulled into the abyss.
Claudia's the one who snaps him out of it.
She's the driving force behind their escape.
And from there, they go on this quest for answers. That scene in the church where the narrator confronts the sacristan.
It's heartbreaking.
That outburst about God and their existence is just so raw.
Like a primal scream for understanding.
And then they discover that Lestat turned the boy into a vampire, too.
It's a reminder that they can't truly escape their past.
And then Lestat returns.
Burns down their house.
It's pure terror.
They have to flee by sea.
And you see this change in Claudia. She seems hardened, like she's accepted the brutality of their existence.
Yeah, and she becomes fixated on finding older vampires, believing they might have the answers she's looking for.
Their journey to the old world, that whole thing with the Mediterranean Sea.
It's full of disillusionment.
They don't find the wisdom they were hoping for.
No, they find something much darker.
Like that encounter at the European Inn with the Englishman, Morgan?
His story about the resurrected corpse, Emily, it's a whole different kind of horror.
Right, it's less sophisticated, more primal.
Yeah, and it shows how diverse the vampire world really is.
And then that leads them to the dilapidated tower.
And that horrifying ancient vampire.
It's a brutal fight.
They manage to kill it.
But then they find that human still alive inside the tower.
It shows the casual cruelty that can come with that kind of power.
And the narrator ends up turning Madeline in a European city.
It seems like an act of desperation.
Right, like trying to give Claudia a companion.
To fill that void of human connection.
They finally reach Paris.
But the narrator's perception of the city has changed.
The art that once moved them now seems distant.
Like a reminder of a world they no longer belong to.
And then Claudia meets Armand.
And it affects her so deeply.
Right, she becomes withdrawn.
Like she's under his influence.
And in response to her distress, she creates that human companion, Madeline the dollmaker.
It's a heartbreaking attempt to regain some semblance of humanity.
But it doesn't really work, does it?
No. Claudia's anger and dissatisfaction just keep growing.
And then they get that invitation to the Théâtre des Vampires.
And that note from Armand.
It feels like a trap.
It is. It's a lure into this hidden, dangerous world.
That whole experience at the theater is just unsettling.
The performance is so macabre.
And then they realize there's a real vampire on stage.
It blurs the lines between performance and reality.
And backstage they encounter Armand again.
And he has this hypnotic power over Claudia.
It's scary.
And she reveals that Armand told her she should die.
It's chilling. Armand tries to stop the narrator from leaving.
But they're already deeply disturbed by what they've seen.
Right. And then that whole thing with Santiago, it just proves how manipulative Armand really is.
They're caught in his web.
And then the confrontation happens. Claudia trying so desperately to transfer her life force to Madeline.
It's a tragic attempt to escape her fate.
And it fails.
The other vampires punish Claudia and Madeline. They burn them alive.
It's horrific. And the narrator gets captured, imprisoned in a coffin.
It's a moment of complete powerlessness.
And then Armand releases the narrator.
And they have that strange confrontation with Lestat at the theater.
It feels like a nightmare. They can't escape their pants.
No, they can't.
And Armand admits he couldn't save Claudia and Madeline.
It shows how even the oldest vampires have limits.
The narrator flees to the cemetery, overwhelmed with grief.
It's a retreat into isolation.
And they decide to take revenge on the Teatro de Vampires. They set the whole place on fire, and then they have that final conversation with Armand.
He seems so weary.
Yeah, disillusioned, like he's finally tired of it all.
And the narrator comes to this realization about the cyclical nature of their existence.
They leave Armand, and there's that brief moment where Armand connects with Immortal.
It's almost like a flipper of his lost humanity.
But the narrator remembers alone, surrounded by death.
It's a powerful image of their eternal isolation.
And then that last thought about Lestat.
It brings the story full circle.
So we follow the narrator through these early years as a vampire.
We've seen their transformation, their struggles, their relationships.
And how their perspective on life and death completely changes.
Yeah, and that image of the last sunrise really stays with you.
It's such a powerful symbol of loss.
It really is.
Hopefully this deep dive has given you some insights into these excerpts from Interview with the Vampire.
We wanted to explore those complex themes.
About identity, morality, and the perception of life and death.
And make it engaging without getting too academic.
Right. But it leaves you with a lot to think about.
Like whether true connection is even possible with eternal life.
Or is isolation the inevitable price you pay?
It's a question that makes you think about the nature of connection in your own life, too.
Even though our lives are finite.
Yeah, it's a powerful thought to end on.
It really is.